Okay, then here we are for episode 2. Scott, how are you, my man?
I am very well, thank you, mate. How are you doing?
Good, awesome, yeah, perfect. So today, then, guys, we're going to bring to you episode 2, which hopefully you'll watch the first one of understanding exactly what this is for. But in this episode, really, we want to be looking at and talking about sort of like building resilience. Obviously, it's important to understand what resilience is first of all. So we'll go through that in a second. But it's building resilience in general, but then also in today's climate, because, we can't ignore that the COVID's happening, because at the end of the day, it's been a huge part of so many people's lives. I don't think there's going to be one person that would say they've enjoyed it. So let's just hit it in the face and, sort of like deal with it at the end of the day. So Scott, let's open up with you first of all, man, of what is resilience? If someone says that they want to build resilience, what are they trying to do?
I really like the word resilience, because I think there's quite a few different connotations people can get from it. But for me, if I were to define it simply, it would be the idea of building the ability to consistently overcome obstacles and to do that under pressure. And again, pressure is quite a subjective word as well, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But if you were to separate it really into two kind of distinct areas, one would be the more kind of sports psychology, definitive approach, which is to look at overcoming stresses, right? So very like quantitative forms of pressure that we face as athletes. And you can separate those up into however many different areas. The basic would be kind of social, environmental, obviously physical stresses and so on. And we can kind of go down that road a little bit more later, but you can separate that in a very quantitative way. Whereas you always have another side of resilience, which we will talk about today as well, which is the more subjective interpretation. I would use the word adversity as well, talking about overcoming adversity. Now, why is that subjective? Because every individual will have an individual definition for that term, whereas resilience is a objective, quantitative term that can be split up into these factors that we can observe in our training and in our day-to-day, right? Yeah. So I think when exploring resilience, it's important to look at both sides and to then create a balanced approach to try and give yourself what you need, or give the individual what they need to navigate those obstacles.
Yeah, no, good. Agree. To be fair, I can't really give any more of what it means by resilience, because you've near enough covered everything there for me. The only thing I'll sort of add to it, in my opinion, is like I always see resilience as taking steps up a staircase, for example. Like, in life, there's going to be so many different things that we will face that we have to at some point overcome, or it will beat you. And that's, we can look at this in all different ways. I'm obviously, in my athlete life, in the army, it could be in work, in working in Tesco, stacking shelves, whatever it is. Everybody has different levels of understanding, like, their resilience level and what they're able to, how they're able to work under pressure, like you say. Mm-hmm. I personally, I think, I feel I've learned a lot of different reasons to be resilient, in many different ways. But one thing, that I think you always understand as well is you are never ready for the next one. Like, there's always a time where you feel like, shit, I got to pull myself together again, because I'm now handling something that I've never handled before. Yeah.
No, I really like that. In particular, the fact that it's very, very obviously very situational, and it's kind of an ongoing pursuit. You're not simply resilient as a fact, and then that's it. Everything will kind of bounce off you. It's very subjective, which is why when we define your own form of adversity, to some, a situation that would seem adverse is actually a situation that's quite, it's full of opportunity, whereas to others, it's the end of the world. And as you say, you're constantly, you don't know what's going to happen over the next hill and the next day and the next week and the next month. So you're always in anticipation of the next situation in which you're going to need to show up in one way or another.
Yeah. The thing is, I think as well, like I think a big part of it is, I mean, I know we've all heard it before, and people would have heard this before, but I think you need to stop and think about what this means. But it's trying to be comfortable at not being comfortable. That's something that, like, as a target for people to always think about. Like, always, if you try and think, like you say a minute ago, to become resilient, is no such thing, because there is always something different that you've never managed before. And every situation is so different that you can never, understand what it feels like until the time. So I think, it's really important to try and be comfortable at being uncomfortable, i.e. be open to things happening. And, obviously working on yourself, working on your mindset is one way of doing that, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, you're working on yourself to become better at managing whatever situation happens. So often people get to a situation and they just think, I can't handle this anymore. And it's all because you are not open to these situations. And I think support networks are a huge one for things like that, aren't they? And things like this, talking about it, understanding it and thinking about it.
Right, absolutely. And that concept of being comfortable with being uncomfortable is massively important. It's especially with regards to performance, because I think that sport, and in particular strength sport, offers individuals a very unique set of circumstances, because they are consistently imposing on themselves certain forms of adversity, right? They're no longer purely circumstantial. These are self-imposed and consistent circumstances in which they need to display resilience. As you say, they need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And it's fascinating because athletes find themselves under, a myriad of different pressures at any given time. And in order to succeed, they need to overcome those things consistently.
Yeah.
Right. Which is incredibly interesting, because when you look at, people like myself and you and anyone else who competes in any sport or considers themselves an athlete, you really have a constant introspective look into how you respond to stress. And as you were saying, with regards to self-development, this is the key: to constantly look inward, to turn the mirror, towards yourself, and to see how you respond. And performance gives you a fantastic insight into that with regards to resilience.
Yeah. Thing is, though, obviously looking at it in such the simple term, today I was actually chatting to someone this morning who I was talking about, certain people that are good athletes in the gym and then not so good at competition. Now, we weren't talking about anybody in particular, but it's just that sort of trend you see sometimes where somebody in training, you obviously, Instagram, we share what we do, this, that, and the other, and you think, wow, he's doing well. And then the next thing, he goes to competition, you're like, whoa, he didn't perform well at all. And I know this is slightly different, but it comes down to your self-belief and what you become comfortable and not comfortable with, because a lot of the times these guys aren't comfortable with putting themselves under that much pressure, therefore they then fold on the day. And I always find it interesting because it is such a powerful thing, isn't it, to actually do more of that, because so the people that feel like that, they then fear that and do less of that,
Yeah.
Whereas you need to do more. If you're scared of heights, climb trees.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a few really interesting things there. I mean, firstly, that example is a great one with regards to the degrees of pressure and
Mm,
how resilience can manifest in some areas. If you train and you're training consistently and you're putting yourself under that kind of stress, you are displaying a certain degree of resilience. You're capable of going to the gym, training hard, making progress, and that's something you become very comfortable with, right? You up the ante, you add a little bit more pressure and a different degree of it. You have considerably more environmental factors weighing on you when you're in competition than when you're in your controlled environment.
mm,
Then, as you say, certain people don't perform all of a sudden. What was comfortable has now become very unfamiliar and very uncomfortable,
yeah.
and they buckle under the pressure and unfortunately cannot display the ability that they display in the gym when they're on the platform or whatever.
Mm.
And um and that is a great example of how resilience can very much differ depending on context and circumstance.
Mm, no, it's true. I think there's a lot of people though that that I know in the circle of strongman as well that will always keep themselves in the place they feel most comfortable. And don't get me wrong, if it's their personal goal to not reach the top, and not everybody wants to be at world's strongest man, this, that, and the other. But if you're in the sport, you're in it for a reason, and you also see sometimes that people just stay within their comfort zones because it's what they believe they can achieve. And most of the time it's and I obviously, when I speak to people, I literally spoke to someone the other day who I took on for online coaching, and I said to him, about what is your ultimate goal, and he was like, oh, I'd love to hit 300 kg deadlift, I'd love to do this, that, and the other. He was talking about his lifts. I was like, okay, where do you want to go in strongman? And he was like, oh, well, obviously, I'd love to get as far as I can. And he said, obviously, everyone wants to go to Worlds. And I stopped him and I was like, does everyone want to go to Worlds? Like, my mum doesn't want to go to Worlds. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like, think about what you're saying. And anyway, I made him go away and write down what he wants to achieve, why he wants to achieve it, how he would feel once he's achieved it. And I went through like a bit of a process of that with him to get him to, to believe in himself more and understand that he has the potential. But again, like, with him, he said that everyone wants to get to Worlds. It's a little bit like, that means that means you're not putting your energy into that, because you're using that as an open question that everyone wants to get to it. But actually, the ones that want to get there are the ones that say, I want to get there, and actually do something about themselves as opposed to categorizing themselves with everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the assumption and the reason behind that individual's drive is integral, and that kind of brings us to the other side of resilience. We've talked about what one needs to overcome to be resilient, right?
Mm.
Various factors, various stresses, but then what actually makes the individual overcome said thing? What
Mm.
is the driving force of energy behind the individual choosing to, embark on that path, to take the risks, and to want to overcome the discomfort that is, the stresses that they are faced with, right? And you mentioned this before when it came to that individual who was underperforming in competition. They ended up developing a fear of competition and ended up becoming limited by beliefs that they were no longer as good as they thought they were, and that the gym is the place where they can perform, and when they go into competition they can no longer perform.
Mm.
Right? So the question then that you would ask both that person and as you did with your client would be, all right, what do you actually want to achieve firstly, and why do you want to achieve it?
Mm.
Right?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Because if they don't understand that, they're never going to get there, are they? It's like, I say this humbly, but a lot of people ask me, how do you become successful in strongman? Why, how do you do it every day? How are you able to continue it? And I guess, it will be very much like you in the work that you do, right? When you find something that you are passionate about and you found without it sounding too cheesy, but you found your home, like, you found somewhere where you belong or whatever, however you want to put it, you then don't feel like it's you don't feel like it's a chore or a task or anything other than just you're doing it because you have the passion to do it. But that's what I always try and get people to, understand. Like in my coaching stuff, I have a call with them on the first week and I talk about their goals, their food, and everything else. But I really home in on their goals, because at the end of the day, if they don't understand enough about themselves and why they're doing it, then it's, you're banging your head against a wall. And with like resilience building and everything, I think you have to always think about the one thing, that the reason you're doing it. Because if you don't think why you're doing it, and then you're never going to have the the energy and the headspace and everything else to actually overcome these things. And
Right.
again, it's that fire, that hunger, isn't it, behind it, that pushes it forward.
Right, exactly. And this very much kind of goes back to what we started to touch on in our previous discussion, which is, when you are very much unconsciously motivated to do something, you are effectively kind of scrambling around in the dark.
Mm,
You might find the way out of the room that you're in, or you might not, and it's really guesswork, and you have no other option other than to continue scrambling. You
mm,
know, Whereas when you turn the light on, when you create consciousness, when you start to ask these questions, you start to understand why you're trying to do something. And this is a simple why, in the sense of, why do you want to do something? Well, I want to win World's Strongest Man. Let's just go down the trajectory here, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Why do you want to win World's Strongest Man? Because I want to be the best in the world. Okay, great. Why do you want to be the best in the world? Now it starts to become more personal. It's no longer about a
Yeah.
title. Well, because it's the only reason to be involved in a sport is to be the best,
Yeah.
right? And then we've already created a little bit of an understanding with this individual that they have a massive attachment to being the best,
Yeah.
which sounds obvious. Of course, I'm involved in a sport to be the best, right?
Mm,
So it seems common sense, but every individual is going to have an absolutely undiscovered trove of reasons as to why this is the case. Some that they will be aware of, some that they won't be,
mm,
right? What does it actually mean to you to be the best? What is it about you that you think will make you the best,
mm,
right? You have a fountain of self-belief, but why? Where does it come from, right? And these are all just questions, right? But these questions should resonate in a way that hopefully makes the individual start asking more questions, right?
yeah.
And questions lead to answers, and then answers lead to more questions. And it's just an endless cycle of introspection, but in a way that hopefully will uncover more specific information about yourself that can then be capitalized on to
Yeah.
drive you forward. Because once you know those things, you can then tailor make your trajectory in a way that facilitates those things for you.
Mm.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, 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 completely. I think as well, though, with that, there's a lot of people that, you're on about asking question, question, question. There's a lot of people that will ask, or they will ask themselves or be asked one question and stop there,
Yep.
and they will answer it so broad that it means nothing. And then they're still confused and they're still not dug deeper and they still don't get to the root of it. And that's why
Right.
I'm not just selling what you do personally, but that's why talking to somebody that knows how to word things, how to break things down, how to remap things and everything is so powerful. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing worse than me asking you why 10 times if you don't want to answer, if you don't know the answer to it. For you, it's like, I just don't know. Well, that is the reason then. So we need to dig deeper, isn't it? And I think so many people are surface level, like you say. Why do you want to be the strongest? Because if people was honestly truthful, they'd probably say, because I want to look the biggest and strongest and hardest man. Do you know what I
And then
mean?
you can go down that road as well, to be completely honest, right?
Exactly. But I think a lot of people fear saying that because that's probably what they feel like. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and it's an ego thing, isn't it? Um, but it's so
Def-
it's so close. It's so close to both of them. The whole ego of lifting, isn't it?
Yeah, the ego and lifting, I think honestly, it kind of deserves its whole own segment. But yes, it's very important to, as you say, not just to ask questions, because anyone can ask a question, but to ask the right questions in the right way at the right time that elicit a desire for that individual to answer, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because as you say, you can very easily ask questions and people will get broad answers, because honestly, most people, just this is all people, honestly, operate in a semi-conscious state of existence at all times, because it's the default setting. That, like, from an evolutionary biology standpoint, that is the way that best facilitates us to go about our daily business, to survive, to continue going forward.
Mm,
Originally we did not evolve from lesser life forms to ask existential questions about ourselves. Our priorities were a little bit more straightforward,
yeah.
right? So we have kind of as our brains have developed, started questioning the nature of our reality. And the most interesting but also the most terrifying thing is the nature of your own individual reality.
Yeah.
So the primary thing for most people there is the fear of the unknown. People don't like to answer questions because they don't know what they will find,
Mm,
and chances are they might not actually like what they find,
yeah. Very, very
because
true.
people have, innately a desire to understand, but also to be correct.
Mm,
And if you live your life on a certain kind of living out a certain narrative where you believe a certain thing about you and the world around you, and then you dive deeper and you understand perhaps what that root is, and it's nothing to do with what you originally thought it was,
yeah.
that can be quite frightening for people, and it can be quite, your default response to that is to shut it off and to go back to your day to day,
Your
right?
comfort zone, ultimately, isn't it?
Which is exactly. And that's why your earlier point about the comfort zone and being comfortable with the uncomfortable is so
Mm,
relevant, because this desire to learn and to ask these questions of yourself and to find the answers is very much leaving your comfort zone, just as that individual who was going from training in the gym to going to training in competition was
yeah.
leaving his comfort zone.
Yeah. No, it's true. The thing is, like this, if you don't mind me sharing, it leads me on to actually share something really personal about myself that I
Please.
that I last year finally shared with people, if you like. And it's something I was working on with my therapist. And let me tell you the reason I'm going on with this is because, first of all, to become resilient, you have to be vulnerable at certain points, don't you? You have to leave yourself open to be able to rebuild things. And sometimes I think, again, like what you're saying there, like people are in fear of, you know, I guess showing their true self, or they're in fear of sort of opening a can of worms. Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing, isn't it? And I'm sure that's what you mean, isn't it? With that sort of bit where people hold back.
Hmm.
But for me, like last year, I was holding something back, like since I left the army, that I finally released, or whatever you want to call it. Basically, the way I left the army, and I've overcome it and everything, so I'm happy to share it. But basically, when I left the army, I broke my hip, and I left the army, broke my hip, completely left. I could have gone back a year later once I'd finished my sort of like rehab and everything, but I never went back. And I always told people that the reason I left the army was because of my hip, right? Now it was, but there was actually more to it. And I was so ashamed with what I did that I just didn't tell anyone. And what happened is it slowly built up and built up, and I was eating myself away inside because I wasn't telling the truth. And the reason I'm saying this is because sometimes you need to completely lay your cards on the table to even step forward in resilience as well. Do you agree with that?
For sure. Yeah, 100%. I do. I mean, you, in the very nature of kind of looking back and addressing certain things, it it seems as if you are taking a step backward, because
Yeah.
being vulnerable is not something that we gravitate towards because you feel exposed to threats, which is obviously not a pleasant thing, right? So it feels when you do that as if it is a very weak position to be in,
Yeah.
and as a result, you can feel very demoralized and very self-critical. But in reality, what you're doing is you're going back and you're addressing something that did not get the attention that it needed at the time that it needed it,
Yeah.
right?
Real.
And now you're giving it that, you're giving it its the awareness it needs, the consciousness it needs. You're giving yourself what you needed back then, and when that's done, you're almost liberated. You're able to move forward, right? A very simple analogy for that is if you have been, when you're training and you know that something isn't quite right in your technique, you strip the weight down, you stop lifting heavy, you go back to kind of stage one, and you start to rebuild. You're not getting weaker. You're simply correcting something or giving it the time that it needed that you maybe didn't address previously in your training. And now when you return to lifting, let's say we're squatting, we return to squatting heavy, your heavy squat's going to feel 100 times better, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to, again, I really want to emphasize that this is not about fixing things. It's simply giving attention to areas that didn't receive what they needed before.
To develop
right?
further. Yeah, I
To
agree.
develop further, exactly. To move you, and then you can then springboard your success much further than you may have been because you're not being held back anymore.
Yeah. But that, to me, I mean, obviously, I'll share the rest of what the story was, so people do know rather than leaving in the lurk. But for me, I wanted to point that out first of all, is because that is a huge part of resilience, in my opinion. Like, and you've obviously just listed it out exactly right there as well. But for me, like the way I actually left the army was I was on BIF, which is basically your what we call it in the army, where you're injured. And because I was injured, I was on light duties. I was being treated completely different. I was walking around there. It's not like I had my hip hanging off. And do you know what I mean? So it was an injury you couldn't see. But I was actually ultimately I was getting bullied, right? Because my NCO at the time was just being an idiot. He was bullying me. He was just always putting me down. And because I had a temper on me, I guess, I ended up punching him. And then I went out round town one night and just literally took loads of drugs, loads of booze, and just lost my head. So
Wow.
do you know what I mean? Like, for me to I don't know, come out with that, like, after all these years of never telling anyone, was a massive, massive thing. And I always held it back because obviously, I didn't want to tell people the truth. But you know what? You are who you are for the reasons of what you've done. And that's where, you know what I mean? That was for me like a turning point. And again, it's part of, I tell you that story because it's something that, one, I'm proud to get off my chest, I guess. But secondly, to understand that what we do, we're not defined by our past, it doesn't mean any different. You know what? The amount of people that I told that story to, and I was like, yeah, so what? And I was like, you know what I mean? I was like holding my breath, like telling people, and they're like, so what? It's shit happens, these things happen, and we move forward from them. But again, this is exactly what this episode's about. It's about being you, not changing you, becoming more resilient to the things that you experience, and make sure you deal with things, manage things, and move forward.
Right.
But yeah, so for me, obviously I left the army feeling like I'd completely let myself down, my family, everyone else, and it was just it was like a relief. I let this out probably about, I don't know, 6 months ago.
Right. And no, I really appreciate you sharing that and being so candid with it now, which obviously is indicative of how far the processing of that experience has come for you. And if I could just close up and respond properly to that, isn't it amazing when you recall that story and you actually tell it to others, the response of them and how that differs from your reaction and the amount of emotion and the narratives about yourself that you started to ingrain and believe were true, when you then see a different lens, you hear someone else's perspective because you obviously kept it inside, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
how much that differs from what you'd begun to believe about it. And
yeah.
that's a fantastic thing to close on as well. When it is our natural protective mechanism to internalize, because as you say, you fear being vulnerable. What would vulnerability lead to? Most probably ostracization, meaning a threat, something negative, right? So an individual doesn't share, right? But let's assume with you, you have all of this emotion, all of this self judgment, this shame caught up around that act and that process. You never share. So there's no other lens. There's only your lens, your subconscious and your unconscious, and then how that's filtered through your understanding of what happened. That repeats over and over again, becomes more and more true for you until it is true, right?
Yeah.
And it became your reality. That was what your reality became. You shaped it. But then when you share it with someone else, and when you spoke to them, and then they're like, no, man, I can see this from a different light, and that is understandable what you did given the circumstances. And then it almost jogs you back to like, wait, what really happened outside of all of that emotion, all of that self-judgment, all of the pain of it. And it completely changes your perspective, and that gives you that little spark that you need to process what you went through.
Yeah, it's true. But I also, the big thing I learned from it, which is what I always talk to people about, and you know what, if I'm honest, I didn't plan to say this today. Obviously, we didn't plan this, but you know, like, I've not actually told a massive amount of people, but the people who, you know, sort of like need to know, I've told them about, you know, being open, being honest, even if it's just one person you speak to about these sort of things, because again, it moves you forward. It develops your mind as opposed to holding you back. But yeah, you know, I think it's, you know, the learn for me is to always share things and never hold it in, so that you know, I often, without going off on a complete other subject now, but I often think to myself, have I held myself back because of this? I'll never know the answer, and ultimately it doesn't matter, because I am where I am now for the reasons I've got there. But do you know what I'm saying? There is that question of, have I held myself back because of the things I've been holding as well? But again, the answer to that is always to talk to people and always make sure that you open out, isn't it?
Right. And in doing that, and again, let me, make a point of saying, well done for actually doing that now here with a much larger audience. Again, it is indicative of how much confidence and courage you have in your own ability to express what you went through and what you felt and where you are now, right?
Yeah, appreciate it.
So absolutely, of course, and absolutely, when you do that and you do express your what you're dealing with, it takes something that it became incredibly ingrained and incredibly subjective, and it puts it out into the world in a way that can then be reflected on in a more neutral way, in the sense that just in speaking it, you almost hear it again for the first time. And then other parts of you that perhaps are not as collected within that part of you that feels as, traumatized as it did, could then go kind of, hang on, that doesn't sound like me, and then, as you say, that's when that kind of part of you comes in that goes, oh, did this really hold me back? Did I really suffer with this for that long? And it was, and now here I am. But then that in of itself, this was the last thing that I'll end on here, is indicative of how much growth you have then sustained when you can actually look back and say, wow, this actually really held me back, but here I am. I survived, I endured, and ultimately I prospered. You would have never been able to do that. You never even been able to have been conscious of the fact you were really suffering when you were in the midst of it, right? So ultimately, it's a positive marker of growth.
Agree. And rather than saying what we said last week, not on that bombshell, because I said that last week.
Probably
but on,
trademarked
but
by the
on that
BBC.
on that nugget of information, we've hit the 30-minute cap, as you probably heard a second ago.
We have.
But Scott, it's been amazing as always, my brother. I'm sure people will appreciate the episode, and for the for everyone that's watching, we will be doing lots more. So stay tuned, and we will see you soon.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Awesome. Take care. See you later.
Cheers, man.